In the midst of what we're doing around about us, we need to keep that focus on worship. We need to take that worship and we say, where does worship go? Where does worship end up? What goes alongside worship? We find that worship and service go hand in hand. This morning I just wanted to do a little bit of a recap. A revision. It's not a revision as in learning everything again, because you don't need to cram for an exam. There's no test at the end of the year where you get a pass mark. But I just want to be able to share some things and share some things where I see us going over Christmas and into the new year. At the beginning of next year, in meeting with the elders, we've been looking at a couple of things, and one is at the beginning of next year, we want to start the process of finding the person or persons who will fill the pastoral role, the senior or lead pastoral role of this church. And so we will begin that process. And I'm not sure how long it will take, but it is something that some of you will be able to participate in the process and to be able to share with the congregation as we go along. So it's a bit of a challenge and a time-consuming process, but it's one that we can anticipate that God is there with us and will to lead us and direct us and guide us towards the right appointment. Because one of the things about this process is Hills is a Baptist church, and sometimes we forget that we're Baptists, and people say, oh, where do you go? We just go to Hills, and we've kind of dropped the Baptist off, although, and still, as one of the 250 churches, I think, of the Baptists in this country. And so some of you who've been coming along recently or come from a different denominational background, you're welcome here. You don't have to be Baptist to come here. You just need to be a follower of Jesus Christ, okay? You just need to love God and want to worship and serve God, and you're welcome. And if you haven't got to that point yet, well, we can help you to understand who Jesus is, because there's one of the things that's on our hearts. We want to be able to share who this God is that we love and worship. So that's something which we'll do next year. But one of the things that we'll need to pay attention to is one of the distinctives or peculiarities of Baptist churches. For the process that we go through, the church here will just get a group of people and they will look at putting together the job description and a kind of a profile of the type of person or persons that we're looking for to fill the pastoral role. And then what they'll do is they'll bring that name to the church. And so the church gets to decide whether this person that is being recommended is the person that is going to be the best fit for this church, the person that will take us to the place where God wants us to be, not necessarily find a person that will take us to where we want to be or where we'd like to be. But so there's that finding that person, and they'll bring a name or names to the church, and the church will vote on it. And so part of the distinctives of a Baptist church is the congregation or the members of the church get to decide by vote who comes. So there's that approval. It's not the Baptist Union doesn't come along and say, oh, we're going to appoint this person, and whether you like it or not, this is who's coming. And so we get to evaluate, pray through it, to seek God's guiding, and to bring a recommendation to the church. One of the distinctives is that in voting, you need to be a member of the church. The idea of belonging to a church or being a member sometimes carries a little bit of baggage. Is this like being a member of the rugby club or member of the golf club or something? Well, what it does is membership. You don't have to be a member to go to heaven. It's okay. You don't have to be a member to get salvation. I just need to clear that up. So you walk with God, and God loves you just as much if you're not a member as if you're a member. Okay, but becoming a member means that you have that responsibility together with the other members to say, yes, collectively we believe this is the right decision, this is the right person, and so you get to have a say in it. And one of the things that I want to do at the beginning of next year is talk a little bit more about membership, what it means to be a member, what the benefits are. And one of the benefits of being a member is not salvation, okay? So being a member enables us together collectively to discern God's will and make decisions that we believe God is leading to us to as a church. So we'll speak more about that a little bit later on. But today I want to just highlight a few things that, one, we're wanting to start this process to call a pastor. But we also wanted to pick up a report that a group of people prepared a few years ago, a couple of years ago. They presented a report. It was a report from the Strategic Working Group. And they had a look at some of the property and some of the things that we have and trying to decide what to do with our properties and how we can navigate some of the issues that we've got with the buildings and stuff into the future. And so we're going to, the elders also said, okay, we think it's time, we need to pick this one up again. So at the beginning of next year, we'll pick this report up and we'll get the people together and we'll say, read through this. And if you've not seen the report and you'd like a copy, talk to Dan or we can arrange for you to have a copy and you can read it over Christmas. It'll be really, really good Christmas reading. Because as you look at it and you read through it, you sort of say, what is God saying to us through this? And as we look at that, I'm just reminded of a couple of things. One is I mentioned, have a look at Matthew 25. I'm not sure if any of you looked at Matthew 25, but I want you to have a look at that. You can just tag it. I'm not going to speak into it now, but have a look at Matthew 25, and it's the parable that Jesus gave of the 10 talents, or some of your Bibles will have the 10 minas or 5 minas, but it's essentially the same or a similar story. But other things that we want to do is finish downstairs. If you go down there, you'll notice that the carpet now is being covered, ready for the work to commence, just to protect the carpet. So that is on the way. I understand that the scaffolding is going to come up the end of the building there, and they'll start painting the windows. We could do that, but it's about 9 meters to the top, and that's probably a job for someone who knows what they're doing. And Dan has ordered some chairs, and they'll come beginning of next year. And in May, mainly music, will have its 35th anniversary. So Joe Hood started mainly music in this church 35 years ago. And so there's going to be a bit of a celebration there for that, marking that occasion. And then in 2026, this church will have been here 75 years since the first service. So I understand that the first service here was in 1951, and it was in the school hall. And so if we need to look at some of those things and say, what is a good way to celebrate that? And then you say, what are we doing talking about all this stuff in a church service? Aren't we meant to be putting Jesus first? Isn't Jesus meant to be the centre? Are we getting sidetracked on some of the other things which really are a bit of a distraction? And I just want to speak into that. We do a lot of things for one reason, two reasons. There might be three, but I'll just do a couple. One of the, in beginning the series on worship, Psalm 99, there's a verse in there. I'm reading from verse 2. Great is the Lord in Zion. He is exalted over all the nations. Let them praise your great and awesome name. He is holy. Then we come down to verse 5. It says, exalt the Lord our God and worship at his footstool, for he is holy. I want you to get an idea of a picture. You imagine the earth, and God is sitting on his throne, and his feet are resting on the earth. Can you imagine that? So that means we have one. I was looking for a big throne. I couldn't find one. I would just love to have put a massive throne here and put a little globe down there and got our tallest person to slouch in that and rest their feet on the earth. And so we have from this the guy is saying, exalt the Lord our God and worship at his footstool. Yeah, in the scriptures, feet are not the best thing. Okay, if some of you have lived in third world countries, you'll know that feet were people that walk around without shoes. Their feet are broader, and there's actually gaps between your toes. Okay, and the sole of the foot is calloused. And I heard an advertisement. I think it was on the TV or somewhere about getting your feet ready for summer. And I thought, yeah, well, there are a lot of people, their feet look quite different, but the concept of feet is something that we really don't want to be near people's feet. And in particular in biblical times, when you're walking everywhere where feet are in the dirt, there's no socks, and you have leather sandals and they sweat, and there's dirt and there's dust. And so one of the customs is that when you come into someone else's place, you wash your feet. And so here we have this concept of in the culture, feet are unhealthy, feet are dirty, and it's one part of the body that you don't want to get near. And yet we find a lot of examples in the New Testament where people intentionally did that. In Mark chapter 5, one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus, came to Jesus and fell at his feet. In Luke chapter 7, the woman came, was mentioned last week. The woman came and stood behind Jesus, behind his feet, and weeping, she wet his feet and anointed his feet. And in Luke chapter 8, we have the instance where a woman has had a bleed for many years, and she's ostracized, and she's an outcast. And what she does is she comes and she falls at Jesus' feet. And when Jesus went over to across the other side of the lake, and he met the demon-possessed person in the graveyard, and this man came, when he saw Jesus, this man came and threw himself at his feet, and the demons inside the man said, "What do you want with me?" And so not only people fall at Jesus' feet, but here in the spiritual realm, the demonic came and they fell at Jesus' feet. In Acts chapter 10, we have the account of Cornelius. Cornelius comes, and Peter works a couple of miracles, and Cornelius falls at Peter's feet. And Peter says, "Don't fall at my feet. Stand up, because I'm a man. I'm a man like you. I'm a person like you." And so here we have this image of falling at Jesus' feet is a position, or it's a posture of humility. It's a posture of worship. It's a posture of elevating the person who you've fallen at the feet at. And so through the ministry of Jesus, when he meets some of these people or encounters with people, the natural response for them is to fall at his feet. So what makes the story or the example of Jesus is halfway through a meal, Jesus gets up and takes his shirt off. He picks up a basin. He picks up a cloth. And he washes the disciples' feet. He speaks of the humility. He said, God is on his throne, and his feet are on the earth like a footstool. And the earth is in a position, in a posture of worship to the Almighty God. And for us, as believers in Jesus Christ, we are on this planet. We're at the feet. And so we worship in the congregation here. We worship in private. We worship in other places. We worship together as the whole believers of Christ. We're also placed at his feet in a place of humility, in a place of submission, in a place of reverence. He said, when we get an understanding of what that picture is and what it's like to come and worship God in this place of humbleness, of humility, of complete surrender, there is nothing that we can offer. There is no words that we can say, but we are in this place and in this position, and we're recognizing the greatness of God and just falling at his feet and being at his feet. He's an act of worship. And you say, what about the rest of the world? What about the atheists? What about the agnostics? What about the people who hate God? Jesus, the Father says, Jesus will reign until everything is under his submission and everything is at his footstool. So we have the people who don't know Jesus Christ, people who rebel against God, people who don't know God exists, are also in this place, in this position of humility and in this place of worship, but they don't recognize it, they don't see it, they don't understand it, they don't realize what is there. And so when we come to pray the Lord's Prayer, we come and pray the Lord's Prayer out of this posture of humility. We say, your kingdom come, because we want God's rule and God's reign to come. We say, your will be done. We want to willingly submit ourselves to the rule and the reign of God. And then you say, well, what else is there? Is that all there is to it? What happens after we worship? Worship, the final thing. And here I want to introduce something that I want to speak out into a lot more next year. One of the things that we say as a church, we want to live as God intends us to live. So, in other words, we want to live our lives as individuals, and we want to be together as a congregation that will live and work together and be in one accord together in a way that God intended us to interact and relate to each other and to God Himself. And one of the ways to summarize that is one of the Pharisees said, what is the greatest commandment? And Jesus said, the greatest commandment is this: love the Lord your God. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength. So you find that in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and some is mind and some is strength, and some misses one of those out. But the intent is the same. Love the Lord your God. But he didn't finish there. The ruler or the lawyer said, what is the greatest commandment? And Jesus came back and said, this is the greatest commandment, is to love God and your neighbor as yourself, or your love God and everyone else. The Thereo translation is love everyone else. So you don't have to define what a neighbor is. You say, well, he's not my neighbor or she's not my neighbor. It just says love everyone else. And so here we come from this, and we look at the Old Testament, and God gives some instruction to the children of Israel, to the nation. He says, I want you to be careful. Be careful. Deuteronomy 30 verse 17. Be careful. Be careful if your heart turns away, or your heart is drawn away to worship other gods and to serve them. So there's two things here. Love the Lord your God with all your heart. Deuteronomy 30, if your heart turns away, or if your heart is drawn away to worship and serve. So there's two things there. Jesus said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul. Deuteronomy 11:16 says this: be careful, watch out, take care, lest you be enticed, lest you be drawn away, enticed, deceived, misled, to worship other gods and to serve them. And so again, we have worship and services linked together. Jesus said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. And in Deuteronomy 8:19 it says, if you forget the Lord your God, if you forget who He is, if you don't understand fully who He is, if your mind goes on to other things, if you are distracted and discouraged, if you forget the Lord your God and go after other gods and serve them. Again, worship and service go together. When Jesus was tempted in the desert just after He was baptized, He went into the desert, and one of the temptations was, Jesus, if you will fall down and worship me, I will give you I will give you power, and I will give you authority. These were the very things that Jesus came to earth to get. Jesus came to bring back the authority of Satan and the power of Satan, and to restore that back to God. And so Satan's giving him a shortcut. And Satan said to Jesus, if you bow down, I will give you these things. If you bow down and worship me, I will give you this. And Jesus said, worship the Lord your God and serve him only. So these two things are tied together. And here I want to suggest, I'm not going to give a lot of detail or a lot of justification for how this comes, because I want to unpack it a little bit more later on next year. I want to pick up the theme of worship. What is worship and service? How do these two things go together? How do they relate? What does it look like? And Jesus says, worship the Lord your God. I'm really grateful for the way Josh and Hannah are helping to develop an understanding of worship. And I realize this is actually quite difficult. It's difficult for a number of reasons. One of the problems we could have next year is we start to look at the stuff downstairs and we start to wonder about what we're going to do with the properties, and we wonder and work towards who the next pastoral person or persons are, that we get distracted from the very things that we need to give our attention to. It's going to be very, very easy next year to lose sight of Jesus in the center. And so what I want to do is pick this theme, this topic up again next year, because we need to keep in the midst of what we're doing around about us, we need to keep that focus on worship. We need to take that worship and we say, where does worship go? Where does worship end up? What goes alongside worship? We find that worship and service go hand in hand. So you ask yourself the question, what does my worship look like if I don't serve God? What does it look like? What does my service look like if in the midst of my service I forget about worship? What does the church look like where they serve God with all their heart and all their soul and their mind, and they forget what it is to worship him? What do they become? And the other passage I want to pick up on is Matthew 13:44 to 46. Jesus gave some parables about the kingdom of heaven. He said the kingdom of heaven is like this. The kingdom of heaven is like a man who sees some treasure in a field. The field doesn't belong to him, the treasure is there in the field. And so he goes away and he sells everything. He sells everything he has so that he's got enough money, and he goes and buys that field and then digs up the treasure. And then it goes on to the second one from verse 45, very short. He's like a merchant, like a person who buys and sells pearls, and he sees one, and this pearl is absolutely magnificent. And he wants it. He can't afford it. So he sells what he has, and he finds the money, and he goes and buys this pearl at a great cost. To hold on to that thought. In 2 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians chapter 4. And starting at I'll start at verse 2. Oh no, start at verse 1. Therefore, since through God's mercy we have this ministry, we do not lose heart. Rather, we have renounced secret and shameful ways. We do not use deception, nor do we distort the word of God. On the contrary, by setting forth the truth plainly, we commend ourselves to every man's conscience in the sight of God. And even if our gospel is veiled, it is veiled to those who are perishing. The God of this age has blinded the minds of the unbelievers so that they cannot see the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. For we do not preach ourselves, but Jesus Christ as Lord, and ourselves as your servants for Jesus' sake. For God, who said, "Let light shine out of darkness," may this light shine in our hearts to give us the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Christ. We have this treasure. In Corinthians 4, this treasure is the gospel of Jesus Christ. A treasure is something which is worth an enormous amount. And so as we go into next year, and as we go over the Christmas and into next year, I want us to look at what this treasure is that we have. What does this treasure look like for you, and what does this treasure look like for me, and what does this treasure look like for a church? And what do we need to do as a church? What do we need to get rid of so that this treasure can be seen, this treasure can be released, this treasure can become something which its worth and its value is truly appreciated by us, and we take that treasure and we use that treasure in the way that that treasure is going to do things for the kingdom of God. So in other words, we have a treasure within us. We have something of immense worth and immense value. We can't keep it to ourselves. And sometimes that treasure is going to come at a cost. It's not cheap. They're coming at a great cost. Are we prepared to pay what we need to pay so that we can have this treasure? We can have the fullness of the gospel of Christ. We can have the fullness of Christ in us. The fullness of the Spirit of God in us. We have the fullness of the gifts of God in us. We have the fullness of the fruit of the Spirit. We have the fullness of Christ dwelling in us. And that fullness of Christ leads us into worship. And that worship has got to go somewhere. You can't contain worship. Worship has to be expressed. That's why Jesus puts worship and service together. The trouble is we don't like service, and I want to speak into that a lot more, because here you are, just imagine the person at the bus stop. You say, you got a couple of minutes before your bus comes, I want to tell you about Jesus. And if you want to follow Jesus, you've got to give up everything you got and become a slave. And if you become a slave, then you have no rights. But it's really good following Jesus. Being a servant and serving God is a hard thing to talk about. So I don't want us to lose the focus on worship. We cannot lose that focus. We cannot stop learning about what it is to worship God. We cannot stop learning what it is to express and verbalize our devotion to Jesus. We can't stop doing that. Alongside that is another thing which is difficult. I went to the scene yesterday and it was awesome. But at the end, there's a kaumata who gave an illustration. I thought, oh, this is fantastic. I'm going to use that. Sometimes you can pinch someone else's illustration if you know no one else has seen it or heard it. But this was awesome. And he stood there and they actually did a haka. It was fantastic. He said, when you go away, I want you to take 4 things with you. He said, I want you to take a tea towel. Why don't you take a tea towel? And then he said, I want you to take a potato peeler, but I haven't got a potato peeler. I got Dan's overalls. They would take the outer garments off because it's dirty work cleaning feet. And when you take some clothes you can work in, prepare yourself for the mahi. And when you take a broom, and when you put on your gumboots. Because these things are symbols of a servant. They're symbols of serving. They're symbols of worship. And so as this year comes to an end, and you say next year, let's look at this. I say, love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your mind, all your soul, all your strength. Worship and serve. Brother, sometimes things are a bit too big and too much and too disruptive and too costly. You say, brother, I just ask that as we consider what your word is saying, help us to continue to find those times and places where we can speak out or sing out or shout out adoration of you. We do that with the attitude of a servant. And as we understand what it is to serve you and to serve others in this earth, the treasure that we have in us, that power of God, that immense wealth and worth of who God is, will be manifest through us. And more often than not, Father, it won't be through the flashy things, it'll be through the simple serving of a people who are humbled by your presence, humbled by your goodness. And we worship at your footstool. And we know that as we obey your words and as we live a life that you and how you intended us to live, it will bring honor and glory to you. Many of those that are on this planet at your footstool who are there as your enemies can come into a time and a place where they can be transformed from an enemy of God to a friend of God, to a child of God.